Think about the last time you lost a conversation that truly mattered. You knew the facts, you had the logic, you had the stronger case, and you still lost. You watched the room shift, and no amount of clarifying or pushing back seemed to change anything. You walked away replaying the conversation in your head, thinking, next time I will prepare more, next time I will explain it better. But the problem was not your explanation. The problem was that you explained yourself at all. Every time you justify your decisions to someone who has already decided to misunderstand you, you hand them your power. The courtroom you built against yourself. There is a habit deeply wired into most of us, so automatic that it barely feels like a habit at all. It feels like basic social responsibility. Someone questions a decision you made and you justify it. Someone looks at you sideways and you feel this immense internal pressure to make them understand. Someone pushes back on something you said, and before you even realize it, you are defending yourself to someone who did not deserve the defense in the first place. Here is the brutal truth about what is actually happening in those moments. The second you begin explaining yourself, you shift from a position of authority to a position of defense. You take the psychological high ground and willingly abandon it. By over-explaining, you hand the other person the role of judge. And the moment they are the judge, and you are the one seeking approval, they possess a leverage over you that they did not have 30 seconds ago. You gave it to them willingly. Watch how a dynamic changes when someone questions your choice and you rush to explain. You are essentially giving them reasons to argue with. They poke at your logic, they find the weak point in your justification, and they drag you deeper into a debate that you started losing the exact moment you agreed to have it. But why do you do this? Why do you feel the burning, compulsive need to make sure everyone understands your motives, your choices, and your boundaries? Carl Gustav Jung, one of the greatest names in analytical psychology, identified this pattern as a clear symptom of a profound disconnection from the self. For Jung, the repeated attempt to convince others about who you are and why you act in a certain way reveals a deep state of self-neglect. The person who constantly explains themselves is often seeking something they never received: permission to exist. This behavior usually arises in environments marked by emotional invalidation. Perhaps you grew up in a context where your subjective experience was systematically disqualified. You were told you were exaggerating, or that there was no reason to feel the way you felt. The internalized message you absorbed was brutal. What I feel only has value if others understand, approve, or allow it. Over time, this belief transforms into an invisible prison. You become dependent on others' understanding to affirm your own internal reality. When you as an adult compulsively explain yourself, you are unconsciously trying to avoid abandonment, judgment, or rejection. You genuinely believe that if others just understand your reasons, perhaps they won't criticize you, distance themselves, or reject you. It is a desperate attempt to control others' perception to ensure your own emotional security. But this constant effort comes at a devastatingly high price: your own psychological autonomy. The futility of logic. There is another layer to this trap, one that the 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer diagnosed with surgical precision. Schopenhauer spent his life studying human nature, not the version we wish existed, but the version that actually shows up every day. And his most foundational observation was this: the overwhelming majority of people do not actually think. They believe thinking is an active process. It involves taking in new information, weighing it honestly, and changing your mind if the evidence demands it. Believing is different. Believing means you already have a conclusion, and everything you encounter gets filtered through that conclusion. Information that confirms the belief slides right in. Information that challenges it gets rejected, ignored, or reframed until it no longer feels threatening. Most people you will interact with are operating in belief mode almost all of the time. Their opinions have calcified into identity. When you try to argue with someone's belief using logic, evidence, or carefully crafted explanations, you are not having an intellectual debate. You are challenging their sense of self. And people will defend their sense of self with everything they have. This is the exact reason why over-explaining yourself is an exercise in futility. Schopenhauer observed that people do not reason their way to their feelings. They feel first, and then they reason their way to a justification. The emotion is the foundation, and the logic is just the paint job. What this means practically is profound. You cannot logic someone out of a position they did not logic themselves into. If someone has already decided to misunderstand you, or if they have decided that your boundaries are an inconvenience to them, your well-constructed explanation is not going to dislodge their position. You think that if you just find the right words, the right angle, the right logical demonstration, the light bulb will go on. But the light bulb cannot go on if the socket is not wired for it. When you engage with someone who is committed to misunderstanding you, you end up simplifying yourself. You abandon nuance, reduce your complex positions to sound bites, and start using their emotional logic. Somewhere in that process, you drift so far from your actual truth that you have basically lost the argument before you even started. Engaging with shallow thinking at its own level does not elevate the conversation. It degrades you. The smart person descends to the level of the argument. The limited thinker does not rise. Your intellectual and emotional integrity is worth more than any individual argument. The danger of the persona. To understand why we sacrifice our power so willingly, we have to look at the mask we wear. Jung called it the persona, a social performance, a costume we wear to survive the expectations of the world. The persona is necessary. Without it, society would be chaos. But the danger arises when you start believing that the mask is who you really are. From a young age, you learn to behave, to hide what you feel so as not to hurt others, to control your impulses so as not to seem selfish, to smile even when you wanted to disappear. You learned that to be accepted, you needed to be convenient. You became the person who never causes trouble. You justify every emotion, every decision, every attitude, as if a convincing argument were needed to have the right to feel and to be. You say yes while meaning no to avoid being seen as selfish. You explain your sadness as tiredness because you don't want to be a burden. You feel anger but disguise it as rationality, fearing to seem immature. With each small concession made in the name of acceptance, a part of your soul is left behind. You stop living for yourself and start acting for others, in an eternal theater where the audience has more power than the protagonist. This compulsive self-explanation is, therefore, a profound form of self-abandonment. It is the act of betraying one's own truth to make it more palatable to others. You tell yourself you are just being polite, that you are just keeping the peace. But deep down, you know the truth. You are not keeping the peace, you are burying resentment, and resentment is a slow poison. When you constantly present a version of yourself that is soft, agreeable, and endlessly explanatory, you are not being virtuous. You are being fake. You are acting out of terror, terrified of rejection, terrified of being seen as bad. And what do you gain in the end? You become a ghost in your own life, haunting rooms with fake smiles and dead eyes, wondering why you feel so empty even though everyone says you are such a good person. The virtue of silence. If explaining yourself is a leakage of power, what is the antidote? The answer is uncomfortable, countercultural, and infinitely more effective. Silence. We live in a culture that rewards noise. The loudest voice gets the most attention. The person who always has a comeback is considered quick-witted, and the person who never backs down from a verbal confrontation is seen as strong. Because of that, most people have learned to associate silence with weakness, with backing down, with losing. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this completely differently. He understood that true power does not lie in shouting louder, nor in forcefully convincing others. True power lies in what you choose not to say. The urgency to speak, to respond, to justify oneself reveals a subtle type of weakness. Those who desperately seek to be heard are, deep down, seeking validation. They are reacting, and those who react are being controlled. Someone attacks you and you fire back. What have you actually accomplished? You have validated them. You have confirmed that their words carried enough weight to pull you into the fight. You have entered their arena and played by their rules. Even if you win the argument, you have lost something. You have shown them exactly how to get to you. But when someone provokes you and you say nothing, everything shifts. Silence in the right moment is the most destabilizing response you can give. The human brain is wired to expect reactions. When someone throws a verbal punch and hits air, it creates a kind of psychological vertigo. They expected resistance, and they got nothing. That nothing starts to work on them in ways that words never could. They start questioning themselves. Did you see what they said? Did it even bother you? Do you think so little of them that they are not even worth a response? The uncertainty eats at them. The not knowing is genuinely torturous for people who are trying to provoke a reaction. Nietzsche's ideal of the Übermensch, the Overman, embodies this perfectly. The Übermensch does not need to win debates or engage in cheap emotional games. He observes, he understands, he carefully chooses when to speak, and more importantly, when to remain silent. His silence is not empty. It is a threat, it is authority, it is the sound of self-mastery. While others shout, he commands respect with his gaze. When you refuse to react at the expected moment, you force the other person to deal with their own anxiety. You act as a mirror. Without your response, without your reaction, they lose control of the narrative. Their brain enters a state of alert, projecting their own fears onto you. In this psychological battlefield, silence acts like an invisible blade. It cuts where no one sees but everyone feels. The birth of internal authority. When you finally stop explaining yourself, a profound shift occurs within your psyche. Jung called this the development of internal authority. Internal authority is the individual's ability to validate their own subjective experience without relying on the approval of others. It is the moment when you stop asking yourself, will they understand what I feel, and start asserting, it doesn't matter if they understand, this is true for me. This is the exact opposite of compulsive self-explanation. Compulsive explanation is anchored in insecurity. Internal authority arises from the deep conviction that your truth does not need to be negotiated. This transition is not merely intellectual, it is existential. The center of gravity of your psyche shifts. It moves from the periphery of external approval back to the center of the self, where the totality of your being resides. But this transition requires immense courage. By ceasing to explain yourself, you directly confront the fear of abandonment, the fear of judgment, and the fear of exclusion. You must traverse the desert of inner solitude. It is the moment when, for the first time, you hold a no without guilt, when you do not justify yourself for changing your mind. When you end a conversation without explaining why, not out of arrogance, but simply because you owe nothing to anyone to exist, developing this authority means you no longer need to beg for understanding. You offer your truth as a gift, not as a plea for acceptance. Communication ceases to be a performance and becomes an authentic expression. It is the difference between speaking to be approved and speaking to be true. This state is psychological integrity. The integrated person does not beg to be understood. They communicate, they express, but they do not convince. Their words come from a solid center, not from a hidden lack. How the world recalibrates. What happens when you actually implement this? What happens when you stop providing the explanations the world has come to expect from you? The silence that arises from internal authority often disturbs people. For those who have always expected you to bow, to explain yourself, to correct yourself, the absence of justification is interpreted as rebellion. And, in a sense, it is. It is a silent revolution, an implicit declaration. I owe no explanations to be who I am. Manipulative people who feed on others' doubt begin to lose the game. Emotional manipulation only works when there is perceptible vulnerability, when there is a fear of being misunderstood or disappointing others. Manipulation needs reactivity, but your secure silence is a stone wall. It does not respond, it does not justify itself, it does not dance to the music, it simply is. This completely destabilizes any attempt at control. Relationships that have always depended on your submission, whether emotional, intellectual, or behavioral, begin to reveal themselves for what they truly are: fragile, one-sided, and based on imbalance. When you stop explaining yourself, you break the implicit pact of inferiority. You cease to position yourself as someone who needs to be accepted and begin to occupy the space of someone who already accepts themselves. Some people will distance themselves. They will call you cold, distant, or arrogant. But this is not a sign of error, it is a sign of realignment. Your silence begins to function as a filter. It reveals who was by your side out of genuine affinity, and who was only there because you were easy to control. The people who feel uncomfortable with your absence reveal that they never wanted you. They wanted the role you played. Now that you no longer fit, they do not know what to do with you. This loss is not a punishment, it is liberation. You will lose people, but you will find yourself. When you stop justifying your presence, your boundaries, and your choices, you start attracting relationships based on mutual respect, not on fear or dependence. The practical blueprint. Understanding this philosophy is one thing. Executing it in your daily life requires tactical precision. You must unlearn the reflex to explain. Here is the practice. If there is no explanation, there is nothing to argue with. If someone asks why you did something, you say, "It made sense for me," and then you move on. No elaboration, no softening, no long explanation designed to make them comfortable with your choice. They will push harder at first. People are used to getting explanations from you, and when that stops, there is friction. But friction fades within a few weeks of consistently not explaining. People simply learn that you do not do that. They adjust to the new reality without you ever having to announce it. Stop announcing your boundaries. When you announce your limits to someone who is already shown they will test them, you are not communicating honestly. You are giving them a tactical advantage. You are handing them a map of exactly how far they can push you. Keep what you will accept and what you won't entirely to yourself. Let people learn where your line is by how you respond when it is crossed, not by you telling them in advance. A real boundary doesn't need a speech. It just needs to hold stop over explaining your transformation. When you do the real inner work, the instinct is to share it, to explain to your family or friends how you are changing and why. Do not narrate your transformation as it is happening. Do not explain what you are trying to change. Just change it. Let people adjust to the new version of you without a roadmap of how you got there. The results of your work are visible. You don't have to also explain the process. When someone attacks you publicly, disguised as a joke, do not ignore it, but do not explain yourself either. Stop everything, look at them with calm, clinical curiosity, and ask them to explain what they meant. Say, "Can you tell me more about what you mean by that?" Suddenly, the room gets very quiet. Now they have to either explain the implication, forcing them to own it out loud, or backpedal. Either way, you have flipped the spotlight, and when someone disrespects you, utilize the power of non-reaction. The moment you defend yourself, you have confirmed that the attack landed. You have shown them your button. Instead, pause, take one slow breath, then respond with something completely neutral. Interesting point. Then turn away and continue what you were doing. You denied them the reaction they came for, and you made their comment look small not by insulting them, but by refusing to treat it as worthy of a real response. The untouchable self. Everything we have discussed points to one core realization. The less you seek approval, the more respect you evoke. Integrity has weight, it has density, it has presence. When you stop explaining yourself, it is as if a new frequency begins to be emitted. You no longer broadcast, "Please understand me." You emanate, "I know who I am and I don't need your permission." The world inevitably responds to this. Jung knew that the human psyche is guided by energy, by presence, by internal structure, and not by rational justifications. The person who constantly tries to be understood emits a vibration of submission. The one who no longer explains themselves emits strength, clarity, and authority. This is not about becoming arrogant. It is about finally becoming whole. You start to build an internally anchored identity, an identity that doesn't collapse when circumstances change, that doesn't dissolve when a relationship ends, that doesn't depend on a job title, a social circle, or anyone's opinion of you to remain intact. It exists within you, and when your foundation is internal, loss doesn't break you, it adjusts you. Rejection doesn't define you, it redirects you. The version of you that is genuinely untouchable isn't some fantasy. It is built right now, in every choice you make about where your energy goes and who gets access to you. You do not need to win every argument. You do not need to convince the crowd. You do not need to make sure that everyone sees you as the good person. The moment you let go of the desperate need to be understood by people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you take your power back. You step off their battlefield. You stop handing them the gavel. You reclaim your silence, your energy, and your dignity. The next time you feel the anxious, rising urge to explain your choices, pause. Remember that you owe no one a justification for your existence. Close your mouth, hold your ground, and let your silence speak with a volume that no explanation ever could. The moment you stop explaining yourself, you win.